Hi guys, we are going to go through our study guide. I would recommend for this review session, if you haven't answered all of the questions yet on the study guide, just pause this video, answer the questions as best you can on your own, and then return to this video afterwards to then kind of double check your answers, because just watching this video for all the answers right away isn't going to tell your brain that this is important information. It's just going to tell you, hey, you're watching a video. If you try to answer the questions first, then watch the video, that actually tells your brain, hey, this is something that's important because I struggled to try and remember it, and now I'm learning the right answer, and your brain's like, oh, okay, then this is something I should probably remember for the final, right? So that's my caution. If you want to do that, great. If you don't, that's up to you. But with that kind of being said, let's jump into this review session. So we're just going to go through all of the questions, kind of walk through our notes, and see what we can put together. So let's start with Unit 1, which is observation. So describe 3 factors that affect observation and how this impacts the reliability of personal testimony when putting together the sequence of events regarding a crime. So there's tons of different factors that influence observation. If we remember, we are inherently biased individuals. We are inherently going to try and change things to fit our perception of the world, right? So knowing that, there's some different things that we can kind of quantify as actual factors that affect observation. And so let's go through these. So there's personal bias right away, and that can exist in a lot of different forms. But personal bias about people, personal bias about the environment, personal bias about situations. Personal bias, it's kind of one of the biggest things, right? Any expectations that you have about an event can change the way that you process and perceive an event, as well as level of interest, your stress level, your concentration, distractions. And then, like I said, as well as just bias in general. Also, not to mention the fact that we are kind of always processing things. We're constantly processing different kinds of information, and so it depends on what information you perceive as being important. And that might be because you're in a new situation. So if the situation is new / old, like if it's a common situation, your just state of emotion, if you're happy, if you're sad, if you're kind of in between. I already talked about stress as well, but stress is a little bit different than an emotion. If you're with a group of people, or with the group, if you're alone, so there's a lot of different things that can impact the way that you remember something, some kind of situation. So we can connect all of this then to how this impacts the reliability of personal testimony. It just means that at the end of the day, we're not super reliable. Obviously, as we've learned, there's ways to ask questions that make it more reliable and help us remember the facts a little bit better. But if our brain is constantly forming memories for us, if our brain is constantly putting things together, then our personal testimony might be different than somebody else's, just depending on what we paid attention to and what previous biases or beliefs we have. So that's the first question. That kind of goes into the second one as well. Why might an eyewitness account vary between witnesses? And that could be because of all of these things here. Just the way that they form their memories, their different values than somebody else. It could also be like how they were questioned. Like if they were led to a certain answer, kind of like as we saw the questions, the word choice really matters. So how they were questioned, so word choice. How long after the event? And then, of course, just the personal differences that we learned before in terms of bias and beliefs and expectations and all these other things here. So those are reasons that these might impact the reliability of an eyewitness testimony in court, just because, once again, if you ask a question a certain way, if you make them feel pressured, like any pressure that they might have gotten from authorities or peers, from outside influences, if they're under the influence of like any kinds of substances, right? All of these different things are just, humans are different, which means that we perceive things differently. We remember things differently. We store information and kind of understand our reality differently. And so that makes eyewitness testimony a pretty difficult form of testimony to really nail down as being 100% truth, because everybody has their own unique truth. As kind of a final explanation of what's going on, we just want to look back to the way that we actually process information and how we store them. So we get information from our senses that then go to influence what we pay attention to. Right? Something stimulates our senses, so then we decide to pay attention, and then how we perceive it then determines if it goes from short-term memory to long-term memory. All right, so those are those first two questions. Like I said, they have a lot of similarities. They kind of tie into each other pretty well. And then for this last question, what are 2 ways to improve our ability to be a good observer? Well, it's really just being aware that we do all of these things. So to be a good observer just knows that we are biased, that we do have expectations. And so to maybe try and curb our bias and pay attention to how it's influencing the way that we perceive things. To just do a check to see where our level of stress is at. Are we breathing to regulate our stress level, or is our heart racing right now? Are we feeling really like overwhelmed with our emotions? So being a good observer just really means knowing the faults of the human experience, right? And trying to overcome them, or at least be aware of them, so you can take that in mind when you're then trying to process what you perceived beforehand. And so just knowing that you filter out unimportant information, that we do look for patterns and try to make connections even when they don't exist, and that our memories are, at the end of the day, faulty because we as humans are faulty. All of those things, just being aware of all of those different factors of the human experience can make you a better observer. So then looking at the next question here, what is one way to increase the reliability of eyewitness testimony? Well, as I just mentioned, things like having appropriate phrasing, like making sure that you ask questions in the correct way, that you're not leading them towards a certain answer. So appropriate phrasing and word choice. Separating your witnesses are important to prevent collusion, because then that prevents them from like kind of almost confusing each other. Even if you have 2 individuals who aren't trying to come up with some big plot, they just are trying to remember what happened, they can still influence each other's form of creating those memories. So that's why you want to separate them to prevent collusion. As well as timing. You want to make sure that you ask them their witness observation as soon as you can. The sooner the better. And then there's also some other forms like hypnotism is actually a pretty well proven way to allow people to retrieve memories that they maybe don't even know that they have. So those are a few different ways to improve the reliability of eyewitness testimony. So then knowing that even with this in mind, eyewitnesses are still going to be biased. They're still going to have their own perception of something, right? That leads us to this next question about the Innocence Project. So what was the Innocence Project? The Innocence Project revisiting old cases in which the arrested might be innocent, primarily because of unreliable evidence. And what they found was that in terms of unreliable evidence, eyewitness testimony was the biggest one. Eyewitness testimony was the reason that so many innocent individuals were finding themselves in jail because their eyewitness testimony was just incorrect. It incorrectly labeled them as being guilty. So as the data that we have on our slide says, of over the 200 wrongful convictions that they were looking through at the time, over 180 were due to faulty eyewitness convictions. So it just goes to show how eyewitness is not the most reliable form of evidence, or at least the way that we've been getting eyewitness testimony in the past. Now that we know more reliable features, maybe we can have some better eyewitness testimonies and ways of getting those testimonies, but at least in the past, and in a lot of cases still today, eyewitness testimony can land some innocent people in jail. So that's the answer. They want to revisit old cases in which the arrested might be innocent because of unreliable evidence, and they normally will introduce new evidence methods like technology, such as like DNA processing. We also saw that one example of the gentleman who was able to revisit it and prove, hey, it is way too dark. There's no way they were going to be able to see that individual's face. So there's a few different lessons to be learned, I suppose, about the Innocence Project. So that's that. That was all Unit 1. Now let's move into Unit 2. So Unit 2 is crime scene investigation. So what is Locard's exchange principle and how does it relate to the evidence collected at the scene? Locard's is really important because it essentially says when two or more objects come into contact, there is an exchange of material. And this material tends to be trace evidence. So that has a lot to do with the evidence collected at a crime scene, because if Locard's means that with two individuals, two objects, an individual and an object come into contact, I'll do here, object/individuals. There's going to be an exchange of material. There's going to be an exchange of essentially trace evidence. And that can then help, right? Because then that lets you know that there should always be at least some evidence that you can collect from the crime scene, as long as you are able to find where an individual or an object came into contact with another. So if it was a murder that involves some kind of physical altercation, then you can expect that there's going to be some trace evidence from the suspect on the victim, right? If somebody bumped into something on their way out, there will be some physical exchange. So that is Locard's, and it's really helpful when considering how to process a crime scene and what kind of evidence to look for. So what's the difference then between all of these different types of evidence? We have direct. I'm just going to make a table here. Direct, circumstantial, biological, physical, class, and individual. So let's kind of go through all of these one by one. So let's start with just direct versus circumstantial. Direct evidence, it directly tells you about what happened. It directly tells you the story. So let's say directly tells story such as eyewitness. Because they were there. They saw the the entire thing. Or a video, like a police camera video, that directly tells you the story. Versus circumstantial, which is indirect. It could be really strong indirect, but it's still indirect. So it can be used to imply a fact. But it can't prove it. It can't tell you the full story. Cannot prove a story. And so the really good example I liked from the forensic speaker that we had about the photo, I'll leave it here, just photo example. So for example, if you have a picture of two individuals that are hugging, well, you can say, oh, they like each other, or they're best friends, or something. Or it could be the fact that they were grappling and it just happened to look like a hug. You won't know. You'll have the circumstantial evidence of the picture. It can imply a fact, but unless you have the direct story that tells you, oh no, they weren't hugging, they were like full on wrestling, they were just like resting on each other in that moment because they expended so much energy in their fight, you don't know. So that's why we have to consider direct versus circumstantial evidence. So then let's go into biological and physical. So biological is kind of what it sounds like. It's anything that's body parts. So that could be like body fluids, hair, blood, like any plant parts too. It doesn't just have to be a human body. It could be animal body. It could be anything like that. Plant parts, etc. So biological. Remember, biology, it's not just human. It's plants, it's bugs, it's animals, it's anything that's alive. So those are biological. Body parts are fluids, hair, blood, plants. It helps a lot in court because it helps reduce the suspects to a pretty small group, or could even reveal the individual. So narrows down suspects to small group or individual. So here, let me move this down because my handwriting is so messy. So that's biological. Then physical is something that's more physical. So like a fingerprint, footprint, something that's physical, right? That you can like pick up or see or kind of interact with. So like a bullet. And these can help narrow down to a group, right? Narrows to a group. Mrs. Burns here. While I'm editing, I just wanted to make it clear that there's the exception. Fingerprints, remember, identify specifically to an individual, and there's also instances in which a footprint, a bullet, things like that can also lead to an individual. It's not always just to a group. That's kind of more just a generalization, but there are exceptions, of course. I'll go over those more later on in this review session. So that's biological versus physical. And then finally, let's look at class versus individual. So class evidence narrows to a group of persons or things. And then individual, of course, narrows down to a single individual. And so this is where the shoe example comes in. So we'll just do shoe example. So for example, if you found a shoe print that's just like any classic brand, it could be like an Adidas shoe print or a Nike shoe print. Anybody really could be wearing those shoes. If you narrow it down to a certain size, well, great, but so many people could be the same shoe size. That's all just class evidence. You can say we're narrowing it down to the group of people that wear size 8 Nike sneakers, right? But for the individual evidence, you would need something that actually imply that that is this specific shoe. If it has a wad of gum on the sole of it, if it had a thorn or a rock or a certain tread pattern, anything that would help you narrow it down to an individual versus just narrowing it down to a group. So these are all those different types of evidence: direct, circumstantial, biological, physical, class, individual, and trace. Trace is like a small amount of material. I know we didn't go over that specifically, so let me just give you guys that definition too. So trace evidence is just that small amount. Small amount. Could be biological. So it could be like pet hair, human hair. It could be physical, like soil. It could be really any kind of evidence. It's just a little bit. So these are those different types of evidence. So there's direct, which directly tells you the story, versus circumstantial, that's more indirect. Imply a fact, but it cannot prove what actually happened, and it can't prove the story. Biological is anything that regards something that's living. Human hair, bugs, plants, blood, kind of whatever. And it narrows down suspects to either a small group or an individual if you have something as specific as blood. Physical, which are like fingerprints, footprints, bullets, something that you can maybe interact with more. Fingerprints will narrow down to an individual. So that one is the other one outside of it. Class will narrow down to a group or a class of people, and individual narrows down to a single individual. That's a little bit more self-explanatory. All right, so now we're going to go through the chain of custody process. And the chain of custody is really what allows us to ensure that what we have is actually reliable, valid evidence. So it just maintains the validity / integrity of evidence. And this is really important because if the evidence that you have has been tampered with, so it prevents evidence from being tampered, being made unusable, being damaged, etc. So chain of custody is really important because you want to make sure that the evidence that you have is actually reliable evidence, that nobody's messed with it, so they don't tamper or damage it in a way that might cause the suspect to get away if they're actually guilty. So that's why the chain of custody is really important. So essentially what that means is that nothing can be touched or handled without making it clear who's handling it. So it keeps track of who handles what. And so, for example, if you were to give me a sealed package with some evidence in it, there would be a seal, right, and then the person's signature. I would have to cut it open at a different location, not to damage that seal. And then I'll take my evidence out, examine it, and then eventually then I have to reseal it with the secondary seal with my signature so that we can keep track of, cool, well, this person looked at it first and then they passed it to me, and then I looked at it and I did this, because if I did something wrong that caused any damage to the evidence, well, then they know that I'm the one that's responsible for it, and I might be able to kind of help solve the problem, or I might get fired, but that's why it's so important to keep track of the chain of custody. So now let's get into Unit 3, which was handwriting, counterfeit, and forgery. So what are the benefits of handwriting just as a form of evidence in itself? Well, handwriting is really unique. It's almost like fingerprints. Handwriting is very specific to the individual. So it's a really good form of individual evidence, right? Going back to the evidence types. There's 12 different characteristics that are referenced when analyzing handwriting. So let's go through kind of one by one just to explain in more detail. So in terms of line quality, is the line shaky or is it smooth? In terms of margins, that's just how close together the words and the letters are. So is it like super close like this, or is it further apart like this? Are the words really close? or are they spaced out more, you know? So those are margins. Letter ratio is the ratio of capital to lowercase even, or is it just kind of like random, you know? Continuity. So is their actual writing itself continuous, or is it kind of broken up? Like, does it look like they wrote something and then stopped halfway through and then they kept writing? It doesn't really help if I give you lines. Like, if I were to say, like, but then had to, like, go back to look at it to change the way that I was writing the instead of just writing it as one long word. That kind of goes into connection. So are uppercase and lowercase letters connected? Like, do I go from the D to the E, or do I write it separately if I was writing deer or something like that? Then we're going to look at completion. Are my D's completed, or are they left open? Cursive. Am I doing it in cursive, or am I not doing it in cursive? It's a little self-explanatory. Pressure. Is my pressure really hard, or is my pressure really light? You can't really see pressure with a light word marker, but I did light pressure here. Slant. Are they written with a right slant, a left slant, or are they pretty spot on? Even that was with this. Maybe that's not with a slant. Either way. So is there a slant? Line orientation. If this is your line, are you writing all above? Are you writing all below? Or are you writing like on the line? Fancy personalizations. Do you have a heart for your eye instead of a dot? Do you like to use more tails on the last letter versus just stopping? Anything that you do that's fancy to make your handwriting look more beautiful, like yours. And then finally, are I's dotted and T's crossed? Is your dot to the center? Is it to the left or to the right? Is your cross to the top, the middle, the bottom? Are they even dotted? Are they even crossed? I know when I was in school for a while, I thought it was cool to just do I's with no dot on it. So those are different ways to analyze handwriting. Those different 12 characteristics there. So moving on to the next question. We're looking at what purpose does an exemplar serve in a forensics case? So if you remember, an exemplar is a sample of handwriting. And I had you guys make tons of exemplars, unfortunately. And all those exemplars are just really good examples of your handwriting style. And the reason that an exemplar is so helpful is because it can demonstrate a false hand. It can indicate your natural hand, right? It's really helpful for them being able to compare to suspected documents. So that is the purpose of an exemplar. What are different technologies that exist to examine suspicious documents? Oh, there's a ton. There is infrared spectroscopy. That is really helpful for you to be able to determine like what kind of ink was used, and also the kind of paper as well. It allows you to just determine the molecular makeup of whatever substance it is that you're examining. So this can be helpful for like paper, for ink, kind of like for even an envelope, like sticky part, you know, how it's stuck together. So it can help you look at really any kind of molecular components that you want. So that's infrared spectroscopy. There's also chromatography. Which separates molecules based on polarity and solubility. When we did that in class, we saw the ways that the different inks in black responded to the water's polarity, and then how the different solubility determined then how far up they were able to get on the paper. And there's some other things that you can look at too. So if you do digital enhancing, it can be pretty helpful, especially if you have like a char document. And then for indented writing, there's things like the DocuStat that creates like an electric charge. There's infrared luminescence. I'll put the DocuStat. There's just looking at things with an infrared or black light. So just different lighting sources can help you find things that maybe you weren't able to see beforehand. So there's a lot of different ways to be able to process suspected documents. And so those different technologies that existed that kind of went into infrared spectroscopy and chromatography. So it gave you the answers to those two questions as well. So now let's move into ballistics. So talking about the different types of ballistics, matchlocks, flintlocks, percussions, all of those things. All right, so what's the difference between how a matchlock, flintlock, and percussion cap gun fire? So a matchlock literally has the little like match string that has a fire on the tip that lights the flint, or it lights the powder, the gunpowder that's inside of a little pocket. So that's the matchlock. So you have to actually bring the flame to the gunpowder to fight it in order to shoot the bullet. Flintlock has a literally piece of flint and then like a metal plate. So I'll do flint and then the plate. And so the flint strikes against the plate that then sets the gunpowder on fire, which then allows you to shoot the bullet. And then finally you have the percussion cap, which has kind of like a anvil hammer kind of thing that actually hits onto a primer powder, and that action of actually hitting on it is what then causes the primer to ignite and then fire the bullet. And so the hammer, the percussion cap style is what we use today. So those are those different crude drawings of those different types of locks and the percussion cap. So what are the common components of a cartridge and what purpose do they serve in firing a gun? So if we draw cartridge, you have the bullets. So if you draw a cartridge, you've got like the bullets up here, then you've got the primer, anvil, all of those fun things. And so there's the bullet here. Of course, that's what's fired to cause the damage. And then you'll have all the gunpowder, and that provides the explosion that then sends the bullet to project the bullet, because that's the bullet is the projectile. You have the primer, which begins, essentially it lights the gunpowder. To start this whole chain reaction, you have the casing that kind of holds on to everything. It stores all of this stuff. And the casing is expelled at the end of firing the gun. And then, of course, here is like the rim. That's right on the edge. It has the primer and all that stuff. So this casing is kind of this whole thing. All right, so that's just a general anatomy of a bullet, right? And of course, there's different types of bullets, which we learned about, that all have different impacts on the body. But before we get into that, I wanted to just talk about rifling really quick, because if you have a fired bullet, then it's probably going to go through some rifling. And if we look at the barrel of a gun, there's the grooves and there's the lands. And so if this is the barrel and it's firing out a bullet, the bullet, let me draw that here. Actually, where there's the indentations is where you'll have then the grooves. And then where there's no indentations is where you'll have the lands. And so as we remember looking at the ballistic lab, you were able to see kind of where that indentation was versus where the lands were. So lands are raised and the grooves are recessed, they're indented. And that rifling, so this is rifling, just helps put a spiral on the bullet, which helps with accuracy. Is essentially what that's for. It's like the spin on the football is the analogy that we used. So now that we know kind of all of that anatomy of the bullet itself, what are the different types of bullets and what are the main purposes of each bullet? So there are a few different types of bullets. I will do my best to draw them all as I can. Okay, so we're going to go over these main types here, and then I know that there's other hybrids as well, but primarily we want to look at these ones because the hybrids are going to just be hybrids of any of these 5. So we have the full metal jacket, which is really good at keeping its shape, right? So it has really good ability to just pierce through and penetrate and exit on the other side. So they're really good for target shooting. Then you'll have the hollow point. And remember, this expands upon impact, so it doesn't have very good penetration because when it hits you, it expands and probably gets stuck in the body, which is why it's really good for self-defense, because you don't have to worry about the bullet leaving and then hitting somebody else if you're just hitting the one person that you're trying to defend yourself from. And so I'll say this has low, so the hollow point has low expansion, high penetration. And the hollow point has high expansion, low penetration. And then the hybrid, the soft point, is a really good in-between. It has pretty good expansion and pretty good penetration. So let's see. So it's a hybrid of the hollow point and the full metal jacket. And so it has good expansion and good penetration. And it's really good for hunting because of those aspects. So looking at a few other ones that aren't as common, we have the wad cutter. And so they're good for target practice because they leave a really clean hole. And then lead round nose is really historic. It's one of the oldest type of bullets out there. They're also pretty good at shooting and hunting, but they do have that lead pollution. So there is that. So there's the lead round nose, which is really cheap and common. And so they're used for pretty much anything.
Anything.
Oh, you can tell I'm getting tired. So those are those different types of bullets here. Now let's go into the last 2 questions, which talk about what ballistic analysts do when they're actually trying to put together a sequence of events with all this information. So the first part here is what do ballistic analysts look for when analyzing a fired bullet? And what they look for is kind of exactly what you guys looked for when you were doing the ballistics lab. We're looking for the caliber, and we want that in both inches and millimeters. Looking for the weight in grams and in grains. Looking for the length, looking at the rifling pattern. You're looking at Well, that's all for the bullet. You're looking if there's any like impact marks, especially if you're like taking this bullet out of like a wall or something like that. And then for the casing, you're looking for ejector marks, pin marks. You're looking at any like writings or branding. You're looking at the material, like what kind of metal is it? Same thing with the bullet. You're looking at the material as well. You're looking at the bullet type. So essentially anything that could tell you what kind of bullet it is. There's a lot of databases regarding different types of bullets and casings, and so if you're able to determine that kind of those kinds of characteristics, especially when it comes to bullets, because the rifling pattern is so individual to the particular style of gun, and sometimes even the specific gun, these can really help you narrow down a suspect. And then finally, how do ballistic analysts determine the trajectory of a bullet? Well, they look at the bullet hole to see if they can find the angle of fire, and then they have to make those triangles and to do that kind of calculation where we kind of did one example in class. We didn't get a chance to return to it. They're looking for 2 reference points. So they can have 2 reference points such as 2 bullet holes, or you can have like a wall or a hole in the wall and a hole in the victim. You can have, for example, the one that we did was like the car window and then through the car headrest. So you want 2 different reference points, and that'll help you find the trajectory. So if we had like a hole here and a hole here, being able to find that trajectory, and then you'll make the triangle so that you can find the height and the distance and be able to pinpoint the exact location that somebody fired the gun from. And if you can't find the bullet hole, you might be able to find a spent casing, or you can find gunshot residue, anything that will help indicate where, or at least in general area, where that bullet was fired. And so, yeah, we don't have to go through the entire example, but having those 2 reference points is kind of the main thing that you need to have to be able to do all the math to then figure out the rest. Okay, so finally, we are moving through fingerprinting, which is the most recent unit that we've worked on here. So what purpose do fingerprints serve in forensic science? Well, essentially, fingerprints are a really good form of identifying individuals. So they're a great form of individual evidence. They're unique. Help with identification. So why do individuals have unique fingerprints? Well, that all comes back to how they form. So this is going to answer probably both of those questions here. So if you remember, we have the epidermis, the basal layer, and the dermal layer, or the dermis. And essentially, the basal layer grows at a different rate. It grows faster than the epidermis and the dermis. And so growing at the different rates create pressure that then cause this to wrinkle and fold, and then so the epidermis will wrinkle and fold above it. And so essentially it's the basal layer and the way that it gets impacted by the pressure of the epidermis and the dermis that causes our fingerprints to grow. And there's that video that you guys can find in the video folder on Schoology that'll explain in more detail exactly how that occurs. But essentially, that's how like the actual shape of our fingerprint forms, is because the basal layer grows faster and they collapse and fold in different directions. And then the actual print itself, like how it forms on surfaces, is based on just the different kinds of secretions that we release in our hands. And so, let's see, so fingerprints are created by our oils or any excretions from our glands. We have endocrine glands that are under the skin, and they secrete water, oil, salt, dirt, sweat. That's why your palms get sweaty, by the endocrine glands. And so those are what cause our fingerprints to form. I've got a ton of ink on my fingers, so if I were to put it on the whiteboard, you could actually see a pretty good fingerprint. So something on top of our fingerprint would help too. But essentially, fingerprints are the actual print themselves, and then this anatomy describes the dermal ridges or the friction ridges that are the technical name. So dermal or friction ridges are the anatomical name for all of those grooves that we see on the tips of our fingers, our toes, our palms, all of that stuff. So what are the three main types of fingerprints then? We went through quite a few different types. There's those hybrids and variations, but in terms of the three main forms, there are loops, whorls, and arches. So loops start and end coming out of the same side. So whorls are a really good bullseye. They kind of look like that target, and they've got the deltas on the side. Loops also will have like a delta like right over here. And then arches are just arches. They start on one side and leave on the other. So how do you find the core, delta, and ridge count area of a fingerprint? Well, to find the delta, you want to look for that triangle. And then to find the core, you want to find just the center of either the loop or the whorl. And then to find the ridge count area, then you just connect them. So you would connect all of those, the core and the delta, in order to find the ridge count area. Because arches don't have chords or deltas, they also don't have a ridge count area. So that's pretty simple there. In terms of how common each type of fingerprint is, the loops are the most common at 65% of population having those. Whorls are a little less common for 30%, and then arches are really uncommon, being 5% of the population. So loops are the most common, whorls second most common, and arches are the most uncommon or the most rare. And then finally, let's see. So what are the different types of minutiae you might find when analyzing a fingerprint? Hopefully you can see kind of what's going on here in terms of all of these different things, but there's also a really great picture of them on your slide. So let me go ahead and draw then just on their own what these look like. So if these are, that's just a dead end, fork. An island is a little bit shorter, so it's also known as a short ridge. And then you can have a dot, which is like a really short one, spur, and a bridge. So bridge actually connects, while a spur doesn't actually connect all the way. An eye is creating like a bubble almost. Then a double bifurcation is almost like you have two forks. A delta, as we learned, is like a triangle region, and then a trifurcation is splitting off into three. So those are the different kinds of minutiae that you can find when you're analyzing a fingerprint. And then finally, how are fingerprints taken when you are in a case? There's a lot of different ways. So let's talk about those quickly. So physical would be like dusting. You could use like a carbon powder, or you could use really anything. This is like a finely milled powder. There's some that respond to the oils a little bit better in your fingerprints. There's a lot of different types of technologies, or maybe they're charged. So you can do like magnetic powder as well. Basically, finely milled powder that will stick to the oils and different aspects of your fingerprint. So those are physical. Versus chemical, that chemically respond to what's inside of your fingerprint. And we did that one in class, fuming. We used the acrylate, which was the super glue, which turns them white. And we do that in like fuming. You can also do ninhydrin. All these chemicals, silver nitrate, that just respond to the actual components, molecular components of your fingerprint, iodine fuming. So for fuming, it's kind of like you have to fume that specific area. You can fume an entire room that will have all of the prints reveal themselves. Meanwhile, physical is more like a dusting with a brush, and you have to be really gentle to make sure that you aren't actually stripping away the fingerprint when you're trying to dust it. Okay, so there's physical and chemical, and so those are the different ways that you would be able to reveal a print. And then after you reveal the print, then you will take your tape, and so I guess we'll say step 1, locate the print. Step 2, reveal the print, either physically or chemically, using one of these methods. And then you want to transfer the print so you can tape it. You can either take a picture of it, and then just have that photo be your photo, or you can transfer it after you've taken the picture with tape, or you can make an impression, and then put it in an evidence bag. Well, I guess it would be seal, sign, and prepare for chain of custody. Alrighty, so that's pretty much the study guide there. If you guys have any questions while you're studying, then please feel free to email me. Remember, you can also use all the review videos from past tests that are still on Schoology, as well as those study guides would be helpful to work through. Use this as a tool to help prepare you, and good luck on the final. Thank you.